HOA Karen tried breaking into my garage, but my cop son was waiting with a warrant. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon. But suddenly, I heard the sound of chains rattling outside my garage. When I looked closer, there she was. HOA Karen, pulling hard on the chains, her eyes filled with anger. What she didn't know is that my son was already inside. And he wasn't just visiting me. He was waiting, with a warrant in his hand. And the moment she yanked one last time, everything changed. What happened next will leave you speechless. Hello friends, and welcome back to HOA Max Stories. I'm David. I live in a small neighborhood here in the US, and I've been dealing with HOA drama for years. I share these stories because I know many of you, just like me, have seen what happens when HOA power goes too far. Before we start this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these stories, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Think of it like sitting down with an old friend, sharing a cup of coffee, and listening to some real neighborhood drama. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. I was standing in my kitchen, sipping on my coffee, when I heard it. That sound, that sharp clinking of metal against metal. It was coming from my garage. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind knocking something loose. My old garage door sometimes rattles when the breeze comes through, but this was different. It was steady, almost like someone was pulling, tugging hard, trying to break in. I walked slowly to the window. I remember my heart started racing, because I already had a good guess of who it might be. You see, in our neighborhood, there's always one person who thinks the rules don't apply to them, and for us, that person was Karen. Now, let me tell you about her. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the kind of neighbor who believed the HOA made her queen of the block. She walked around with a little clipboard, snapping pictures of people's lawns, writing notes about who didn't bring their trash cans in on time. She even once told me the color of my mailbox flag was non-compliant. But today she had crossed a line I never thought she would. I peeked out the window, and sure enough, there she was. Karen. Standing right at my garage door. Her hair was wild, her blouse bright red like a warning sign, and her hands were gripping heavy chains that were wrapped across my garage door handles. She was yanking them, pulling with everything she had. The chains rattled, the padlock clanked, echoing through the driveway. And as she pulled, she shouted, "You can't lock me out. The HOA has the right to enter." I froze for a second. Was she serious? Did she really think she could just break into someone's private garage in broad daylight, with neighbors watching? But then, a slow grin spread across my face. Because what she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that inside that very garage, behind those chained doors, my son was waiting. My son, Officer Mark. Now, Mark isn't just a police officer. He's a no-nonsense kind of guy, always by the book, always calm under pressure. He grew up in this house. He knew exactly the kind of trouble Karen had been causing me for months. And on this particular day, he had something in his hand that Karen never expected to see. A warrant. Yes, a real, legal warrant. How? Well, let's just say Karen's antics hadn't gone unnoticed. She'd crossed enough lines with enough neighbors that complaints started piling up. My son had been following the situation closely, and now, the law had finally caught up with her. So there I was, standing at the window, watching this whole scene unfold like some kind of reality TV show I never asked for. Karen kept pulling at the chains, muttering under her breath, looking around to see if anyone else was watching. The street was quiet, but I could see curtains moving. Neighbors were peeking out just like me, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. And then, she did it. She leaned down, grabbed the padlock with both hands, and yanked so hard I thought the whole door would come off its hinges. That's when it happened. The garage door creaked open just a crack, and my son stepped forward. The look on Karen's face, priceless. She froze, eyes wide, mouth open. Mark stepped out into the sunlight, his uniform crisp, his expression firm. In his right hand, he held that piece of paper high. The warrant. "Karen," he said, loud and clear. "This is for you. The way he raised his arm, the way the paper caught the light, it was like a scene straight out of a courtroom drama. Except this was no show. This was real. Karen stammered, What is that? You can't do this. Mark didn't flinch. He looked her straight in the eye and said, This is your warrant. Step back. The neighbors gasped. I swear I even heard someone whisper, finally, from across the street. Karen's face turned red, then pale, then red again. She let go of the chains, her hands shaking. But she didn't back down completely. Oh no. Karen was never the type to admit defeat. She pointed at me through the window, her finger trembling. You called him, didn't you? You set me up. I stepped outside now, couldn't hold it in any longer. No, Karen, I said calmly, you set yourself up. Nobody told you to pull chains on someone's garage. Nobody told you to think you were above the law. Her jaw tightened. The HOA gives me the right. And before she could finish, 2 more officers walked up from the police car parked just down the street. They had been waiting for the signal. Karen's eyes darted between them, then back to my son. Her voice cracked. This is harassment. I was just checking for violations. But everyone watching knew the truth. This wasn't about violations. This was about control. This was about power. This was about Karen thinking she could bully the entire neighborhood into submission. And now, she was finally being stopped. Mark handed the warrant to the other officers. They began reading out her charges, their voices steady, professional. Karen's shoulders slumped. Her hands trembled at her sides. She looked like a balloon that had finally lost all its air. For a moment, the street was silent. Just the soft sound of the chains swaying against the garage door. Then, the neighbors started whispering. One by one, garage doors opened, people stepped outside. Some were shaking their heads, some smiling quietly, some even recording on their phones. Karen turned around slowly, realizing for the first time just how many eyes were on her. She tried to force a smile, tried to act like this was no big deal. But it was too late. The queen of the HOA had finally been dethroned. And as I stood there, watching it all, I couldn't help but think to myself, how many times had she done this to others? How many people had stayed quiet, afraid to speak up? But not today. Today, the truth was out in the open. And now I have to ask you, my friends, watching this story from your own homes. Backhand index pointing right. If you were standing there in my shoes, seeing Karen pulling on those chains with your son waiting inside, what would you have done? Would you have confronted her sooner, or would you have let the law catch her in the act, just like I did? Tell me in the comments, because I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll never forget the silence after my son raised that warrant in the air. It wasn't just Karen who froze, it was the whole street. Every single neighbor, every set of eyes behind the curtains, even the birds seemed to stop chirping. For a few seconds, time stood still. Then Karen did what Karen always does, she tried to twist the story in her favor. She threw her hands up dramatically, chains clattering back against the garage door, and yelled, "This is a violation of my rights. You can't just ambush me like this." I wanted to laugh, but I stayed quiet. Because honestly, I wanted to see what my son would do next. He wasn't just my son in that moment, he was the officer in charge, and the way he stood there, tall and steady, I could see he had control of the situation. Mark lowered the paper just slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Karen, you tried to force entry into private property. You rattled these chains, you shouted you had authority, but you have none. And now, the law is involved." Her face was red as a fire truck. She pointed at the other officers. "This is harassment. I'm just doing my duty as an HOA board member." The neighbors whispered louder now. Someone across the street muttered, "More like breaking and entering." Karen heard it. She spun around, glaring at the houses lined up, her finger pointing wildly. "You're all witnesses. Tell them I was just inspecting. Tell them." But nobody said a word. Curtains twitched. Cameras kept rolling. And that silence, oh, that silence was louder than any words could be. I stepped closer, standing just behind my son. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you had no reason to touch my garage. You don't get to decide what's inside. That's my property, not the HOA's." She snapped back, "The HOA has the master key." I raised my eyebrows. "Really? Show me this key." Of course, she didn't have one. She just clutched the chain, her knuckles white, her eyes darting left and right like a trapped animal. Mark took a step forward, holding out the warrant again. "Karen, this paper is very real." The judge signed it. "You've crossed a line." And that's when her voice cracked. "This is personal. You're targeting me because I enforce the rules." But everyone knew better. The truth is, Karen's rules were never about the neighborhood. They were about control. She loved having power. She loved knocking on doors, scaring old folks, and sending out ridiculous fines. Once, she fined Mrs. Green, the sweet widow down the block, because her Christmas lights weren't HOA approved. Another time, she yelled at the Johnsons because their dog barked too loudly at night. But now, she wasn't the one writing the fines. She was the one facing the consequences. The other two officers walked closer. One of them gently but firmly took Karen's arm, while the other started explaining her rights. She jerked away, screaming, "You can't do this. I'm HOA. I'm in charge here." That's when Mark spoke again, his tone firm enough to slice through her tantrum. "No, Karen. The law is in charge here. And right now, the law says you need to step aside." The neighbors gasped again. Karen's face twisted with rage. For a second, I thought she might actually try to lunge forward and grab the paper out of his hand. But she stopped herself. Maybe she realized how bad that would look on camera. She shook her head violently, her voice shrill. "This neighborhood is going to regret this. I'm protecting property values. I'm keeping order. I finally couldn't hold back anymore. By breaking chains on someone's garage? By yelling at families? By threatening seniors? That's not order, Karen. That's bullying." The street went quiet again. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She had no comeback. Mark turned to the officers. "We have enough." They nodded, and one of them stepped back toward the police car to radio in. Karen tried to follow him, shouting over his shoulder, "Don't you dare. I'll have you all reported." But her voice was shaking now. The confidence, the arrogance, it was slipping away, piece by piece, in front of the very neighbors she had tried so hard to control. And that's when I saw something I'll never forget. Mrs. Green, the widow she had bullied over Christmas lights, opened her front door. She walked slowly out onto her porch, her little dog beside her, and said in a trembling voice, "Thank you, officer. We've been waiting for this for a long time." The crowd of neighbors murmured in agreement. Heads nodded. Some clapped quietly. Cameras kept filming. Karen spun around, her face pale now. You all turned on me," she cried, her voice breaking. Nobody answered. They didn't need to. And in that moment, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just facing my son. She was facing everyone. Every neighbor she'd ever harassed. Every homeowner she'd ever fined. Every family she'd ever embarrassed. This wasn't just my battle. It was the whole street's. Mark held his ground. "Karen, step back. This is your last warning." And finally, she did. She let go of the chains. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands fell to her sides. She looked small now, smaller than I'd ever seen her. But if you know anything about people like Karen, you know they always have one last card to play. One last outburst. One last desperate attempt to claw back control. And trust me, she was just about to play it. Now let me ask you, my friends watching this, if you had been standing there, seeing her finally lose that power in front of the entire neighborhood, would you have felt pity for her? Or would you have felt justice at last? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know which side your heart leans toward. She stood there, shoulders down, hands limp at her sides, and for a moment, it looked like the fight had left her. But then, her eyes flicked up. That familiar spark of defiance came back, burning hotter than before. Karen wasn't finished. She took a step forward, pointing her finger right at my son's chest. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You think this little piece of paper means anything? The HOA will protect me. You don't know who you're dealing with." Her voice was low, almost a growl, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. Neighbors leaned in closer, holding their breath. Mark didn't move. He held his ground, calm and steady. "Karen, this warrant is the law. The HOA doesn't overrule the law." She laughed then. A sharp, bitter laugh that echoed down the street. "The law? The law doesn't scare me. The HOA pays lawyers to crush people like you. I can make this all disappear." I stepped forward, shaking my head. "Karen, you're digging a hole you won't be able to climb out of." But she ignored me. She turned suddenly, her red blouse flaring as she spun toward the crowd. She lifted her arms like some kind of stage performer and shouted, "Do you all hear this? Do you hear how they're trying to silence me? I am protecting your homes. Your property values. Without me, this place would fall apart." The street was silent for a beat. Then, one by one, voices rose up. "Protecting us? You fined me for having a flag in my yard. You yelled at my kids for riding bikes on the sidewalk. You told me my shutters were the wrong color." Each voice came from a different house. Each one louder than the last. Karen's face went pale. She hadn't expected the rebellion. Not here, not now. She tried to shout back, that was for the good of the neighborhood. But the voices drowned her out. The power she had held for so long was slipping through her fingers. And that's when she played her last card. She reached into her bag, fumbling, pulling out a set of papers. She waved them in the air, her hands trembling. "I have documents. Proof. This garage, this house, he's in violation." She turned back toward me, thrusting the papers forward like they were weapons. "You think you're innocent? You're not. I have evidence." I almost laughed right then and there. Because the truth is, those papers were nothing. Old notices, meaningless scribbles, threats she had written herself. But she clutched them like they were the Constitution. Mark didn't flinch. He reached out calmly and took them from her hand. He glanced at the pages, flipped through them, then held them up for everyone to see. "These aren't legal documents," he said, his voice steady. "These are letters you wrote. They mean nothing in court." The neighbors murmured, some even chuckled. Karen's face burned red again. She lunged forward, trying to grab the papers back. "Give those to me. You have no right." But Mark stepped back smoothly, keeping the papers just out of reach. "Karen, stop. This behavior isn't helping you." Her breathing grew heavy. Her hands shook. She looked around wildly, as if searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But nobody did. Not a single neighbor stepped forward. Not one voice rose to defend her. It was over. Still, she couldn't accept it. She dropped to her knees suddenly, clutching at the chains on the garage again, pulling like a desperate child throwing a tantrum. "You can't lock me out. You can't. This is my right," she screamed, the sound raw and broken. The padlock rattled, metal clanged, her fingers scraped against the cold steel. The officers stepped in now, gently but firmly pulling her back. "That's enough," one said. Karen kicked, her shoes scraping the pavement. "No. You don't understand. Without me, this neighborhood will fall apart." I stepped closer, my voice low but clear enough for her to hear. "Karen, this neighborhood doesn't need a dictator. It needs peace." Her eyes met mine then. And for the first time, I saw fear. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being powerless. Fear of finally facing the truth. The officers guided her toward the police car. She stumbled, still muttering under her breath, still shaking her head as if denial alone could erase reality. The neighbors watched in silence. Phones filmed every step. Curtains fluttered as more faces appeared. And as Karen was led down the driveway, still ranting, still clutching at excuses, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes. Satisfaction, of course. But also, something else. A strange emptiness. Because for so long, Karen had been the shadow over this neighborhood. She was the storm cloud, the loud voice, the constant threat. And now, that storm was being dragged away. I looked at the crowd of neighbors. Some were smiling. Some were whispering. Some even clapped quietly as the car door opened. Karen turned one last time, her eyes blazing with defiance even as tears streaked her cheeks. "This isn't over," she shouted. "I'll be back. You'll all regret this." The door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the street. And just like that, the HOA's self-appointed queen was gone. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't fear. It wasn't tension. It was freedom. For the first time in years, the street felt lighter. The air felt cleaner. The neighbors stood a little taller. And me? I stood there, looking at the chains still hanging across my garage, swaying gently in the breeze. And I wondered, how did it ever come to this? How did one neighbor get so much power, so much control, that it took a warrant and 3 officers to stop her? And that's the question I want to ask you, my friends. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think HOAs give too much power to people like Karen? Or do you believe some rules are necessary to keep order in a neighborhood? Share your thoughts below, because your voice matters in this story too. The police car pulled away slowly, its red and blue lights flashing across the houses, and the whole street stayed frozen, as if nobody wanted to move until it was really, truly over. I stood there in my driveway, staring at the spot where Karen had just been screaming only minutes ago. The chains still clinked against the garage door, swaying softly in the breeze, like they were the only reminder left of the chaos we had all just witnessed. Then, it started. A clap. One single clap. It came from Mrs. Green. She was still standing on her porch, her little dog wagging its tail beside her. Her frail hands came together slowly, but the sound was strong, and then someone else joined in. And another. Soon, the whole street was clapping. Not cheering wildly, but clapping with relief. Like an entire neighborhood was finally letting out a breath it had been holding for years. I felt my throat tighten. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. Neighbors began stepping out of their houses, one by one. Some had their phones out, still recording. Some just stood with their arms crossed, shaking their heads. But all of them had the same look in their eyes, freedom. One man, Mr. Johnson, walked over to me. He reached out his hand and said, "About time someone stood up to her." I shook his hand firmly. "Took the whole neighborhood to do it," I replied. He chuckled. "No, it took your son showing her that the law still matters." Others gathered around too. The whispers grew into conversations, and soon the whole street felt alive with voices. For the first time in months, maybe years, people weren't whispering in fear of what Karen might say or do. They were talking openly. Mrs. Green walked slowly across the lawn and touched my arm. Her eyes were glassy, filled with gratitude. "She made me cry over Christmas lights," she said softly. "Tonight, I think I'll finally sleep peacefully." I squeezed her hand gently. "You deserve that peace." But even in that moment of relief, I couldn't shake a feeling deep inside me. Something uneasy. Because Karen's last words echoed in my head. "This isn't over. I'll be back." I knew her type. People like her don't just give up. They find cracks, they look for ways to crawl back in. And with the HOA backing her, I couldn't help but wonder how far she'd go to get revenge. Still, that night, we celebrated a small victory. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, sharing stories about the times Karen had harassed them. Laughter filled the air. It almost felt like a block party, without the food, without the music, but with the same energy of people finally free to speak. One neighbor said she once got fined for having a garden gnome. Another admitted Karen yelled at his grandkids for leaving chalk drawings on the driveway. The stories spilled out, one after another, like everyone had been waiting years to finally speak their truth. And through it all, I listened. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. As the crowd thinned and people began heading back into their homes, my son Mark stood beside me, his arms crossed, his eyes sharp. "Dad," he said quietly, "don't let your guard down. She's not finished. Not by a long shot." I nodded. "I know. But tonight, at least tonight, we can rest." He placed the warrant back into his folder and gave me a look only a son could give his father. A look that said he was proud, but also worried. The street grew quiet again. The last porch lights flicked off. The air cooled as the night crept in. But my mind couldn't rest. I sat on my porch long after everyone else had gone inside. I watched the street, the shadows, the faint glow of the street lamp reflecting off the chains still dangling from my garage. Every creak, every rustle made me turn my head. Because I knew Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. And sure enough, the next morning proved me right. At sunrise, I opened my front door to grab the newspaper. And there it was, a letter. Not just any letter. An HOA violation notice. My name printed at the top. My address neatly typed out. And bold words in the middle, failure to maintain garage door in compliance with HOA standards. I almost laughed. Almost. But then I saw the signature at the bottom. Karens. Even after everything, after being caught, after being taken away in front of the entire street, she still found a way to reach into my home. I clenched the paper in my fist, the edges crumpling. And in that moment, I realized the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. So let me ask you, friends, if you found that letter on your doorstep the very next morning, after watching Karen get taken away the night before, what would you do? Would you ignore it, laugh it off, and move on? Or would you fight back and make sure she never pulled a stunt like this again? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments, because this decision might just change everything. The paper in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Just one sheet, just words on a page, but it was like Karen had slipped a knife between the cracks of our victory. I read it again, just to be sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Failure to maintain garage door in compliance with HOA standards. And at the bottom, her signature. Bold, angry strokes of ink. My stomach turned. She had been taken away in front of the whole neighborhood, yet somehow, she was still reaching into my life. Still twisting the rules, still trying to show me she wasn't gone. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter spread in front of me, the sunlight cutting across it. My son Mark walked in, still in uniform, sipping his coffee. He saw the look on my face and frowned. "What's wrong?" he asked. I slid the paper toward him. He picked it up, read it, and shook his head with a humorless laugh. "She's unbelievable. Arrest one day, violation notice the next. It means she's not done," I muttered. Mark nodded slowly. "It means she's desperate. But desperate people can be dangerous." Later that morning, I walked outside to check the mailbox. And that's when I noticed it. Every driveway. Every single neighbor on the street had the same letter pinned to their front door, tucked into their mailboxes, or thrown onto their porches. Violation notices. All with Karen's name. Mrs. Green stood at the end of her driveway, holding hers up with shaking hands. "She says my shutters are faded," she whispered. The Johnson kids held one too. "She says our basketball hoop is against the rules," their father growled. One by one, neighbors gathered, holding their papers like unwanted trophies. It was a wave of retaliation. Karen's last attempt to hold on to power, by drowning us all in paper threats. The street buzzed with anger. People shouted, cursed, waved the letters in the air. Some tore them up, pieces scattering across the lawns like confetti at a funeral. Others clutched them, uncertain what to do. And me? I stood in the middle of it all, letter in hand, heart pounding. Because I realized this wasn't just about my garage anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood. Karen had declared war. By noon, we gathered in my driveway. Dozens of us, holding letters, shaking our heads. For the first time, we weren't whispering behind closed doors. We were standing together, out in the open. Mr. Johnson spoke up. She's not on the board anymore. She's not even supposed to be near the HOA office. How is she sending these? Mark answered before I could. She still has connections. People inside the HOA who cover for her. People who fear her, or worse, people who like the chaos she creates. The crowd groaned. Some shouted, we should sue. Others cried, we need her gone for good. I raised my voice above the noise. Listen. We can't let her divide us. That's what she wants. She wants us scared, confused, fighting each other. But if we stand together, she has no power. The murmurs grew into nods. People's eyes lit up with something I hadn't seen before, courage. We made a decision right there. We would not pay a single fine. We would not answer a single notice. And we would march, all of us, to the next HOA meeting. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. Dad, be careful. She's cornered now. And cornered people lash out. I knew he was right. But I also knew we had no choice. The day of the HOA meeting arrived. The room was packed tighter than I'd ever seen. Usually, only a handful of residents showed up, half asleep, just waiting for it to end. But this time, the entire neighborhood came. And at the front of the room, there she was. Karen. Her hair pulled back tight, her blouse perfectly pressed, a stack of files in front of her like weapons. She sat at the board table, her eyes scanning the crowd with smug satisfaction. When she saw me, her lips curved into a thin smile. I felt my chest tighten. But I stood tall, letter in hand. The meeting began. She wasted no time. It has come to my attention, she announced, her voice sharp and commanding, that many homes in this neighborhood are out of compliance. These violation notices are not personal, they are necessary to protect property values. The crowd erupted. Shouts filled the air. People waved their letters, some even tearing them up right there. Karen slammed her gavel. Order! Order, she screamed. But nobody listened. Finally, I stepped forward. My voice cut through the chaos. Karen, these letters are a joke. You can't fine people for shutters, for garden gnomes, for basketball hoops. This isn't protection, it's harassment. The crowd cheered. Karen's face darkened. You don't understand. Without rules, this place will crumble. Without me, you'll regret it. Mark stood up then, his badge glinting under the lights. Karen, the law already stopped you once. Keep pushing, and it will stop you again. The room fell silent. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for support. But the board members looked down, avoiding her gaze. The crowd stared back at her, united. For the first time, she looked alone. Her hands trembled. She gripped the gavel, slammed it one last time, and hissed, "You'll all regret this." And then she stormed out. The door slammed behind her, echoing through the hall. The crowd erupted again, not in fear this time, but in victory. People clapped, cheered, hugged each other. For the first time, the HOA didn't feel like a cage. It felt like ours. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen's shadow still lingered. And the question wasn't if she would come back, but how. And that's what I want to ask you, my friends, if someone like Karen had been stripped of power but still had connections, still had anger boiling inside, what do you think they'd do next? Would they disappear quietly, or would they come back louder, more dangerous than before? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how you see the storm that's still brewing. The night after that HOA meeting, I thought the storm was finally over. Karen had stormed out, the neighbors had stood together, and for the first time in years, I felt like we had taken back control. But storms don't just vanish. They gather strength where you can't see them. And Karen was the kind of storm that always came back harder. I was lying in bed when my phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Johnson, just 2 houses down. Check your driveway, it said. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside. There it was. Spray paint. Big, angry letters scrawled across my garage door. Traitor. My stomach dropped. Neighbors began coming out too. And it wasn't just me. Mrs. Green had rule breakers smeared across her shutters. The Johnsons' basketball hoop was covered in red paint. Even the sidewalks had angry words, "Law will pay, HOA forever, you can't win." It was chaos, vandalism in the dead of night. And deep down, we all knew who was behind it. Karen. Maybe she didn't hold the title anymore. Maybe she didn't have the board at her back. But she still had her hands, her anger, and a grudge too deep to let go. I clenched my fists. It wasn't just property damage, it was a message. She was telling us she wasn't gone. She was telling us she could still reach us. Mark arrived within minutes. He pulled up in his squad car, lights flashing silently against the houses. He stepped out, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the damage. "This is escalation," he said quietly, running his hand across the paint on my garage. "She's crossed from harassment to criminal acts." Neighbors crowded around him. Some were furious, shouting about pressing charges. Others were scared, their eyes darting to the shadows as if Karen might still be lurking. I could feel the fear spreading again, like poison in the air. Mark raised his hand to quiet everyone. "Listen, this isn't the time to fall apart. This is the time to document everything. Every spray mark, every word, every scrap of evidence. She wants chaos. Don't give it to her." We all grabbed our phones, snapping pictures, recording videos, gathering proof. It felt strange, turning Karen's intimidation into evidence, but it gave us back a little control. As I stood there, filming the word traitor dripping red across my garage, I felt anger boiling inside me. Not just for me. For all of us. For Mrs. Green, crying softly as she looked at her shutters. For the Johnson kids, standing silently by their vandalized hoop. For every neighbor who had tried to live in peace, only to be terrorized again. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was war. Mark pulled me aside. "Dad, we'll press charges. We'll make sure this sticks. But you need to understand something, Karen's unraveling. And when people unravel, they get dangerous." His words stayed with me. The next day, news spread fast. Local reporters showed up, cameras rolling. Our quiet street, once just another suburban lane, was now on the evening news. "HOA leader turns vigilante," one headline read. And Karen? She loved it. I saw her on TV that night, standing outside her house, giving interviews. Her hair was a mess, her voice sharp, her eyes wild. "I am being persecuted," she screamed at the camera. "These neighbors are liars. The HOA is under attack." She twisted the story, painting herself as the victim, the misunderstood leader, the hero trying to save a neighborhood gone rogue. And the scary part? Some people believed her. Comments online split in half. Some cheered, "Finally, someone is standing up to these out-of-control HOAs." Others wrote, "That woman should be in jail." But for us, living it, it wasn't a debate. It was reality. By the third night, things got worse. I woke to the sound of chains rattling again. My heart skipped. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped quietly to the window, and there she was. Karen. Standing in my driveway. Her hands clutching the same chain she once tried to rip off my garage. Her eyes wide, her breath heavy, her body rocking back and forth like she was possessed. I froze. The beam of my flashlight caught her face. She didn't flinch. She just stared back, her lips curling into a twisted smile. Then she whispered, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "This isn't over." Mark was there within minutes. But by the time he pulled up, lights flashing, Karen was gone. Vanished into the night like smoke. He searched, we all searched, but she had slipped away. The neighborhood was on edge again. People locked their doors, shut their blinds, left lights on all night. Kids weren't allowed outside. The freedom we had tasted for one brief moment was slipping away. And I couldn't help but think, was this her plan all along? Not to win, but to make us feel like we could never win. The next morning, another letter appeared. This time not in mailboxes, but taped to my front door. "You think you're safe with your cop son, but you can't watch forever." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was personal. A threat. Mark took the letter, his hands steady but his jaw tight. "She's pushing for a breaking point," he said. "And when people push this far, something big always happens." I looked around at my neighbors' homes, at the quiet street that no longer felt safe, and I realized he was right. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And the question wasn't if she would strike again, but when. And that brings me to you, my friends. If you had someone like Karen in your neighborhood, someone who wouldn't stop even after being exposed, arrested, and rejected, how far would you go to protect your home? Would you fight back with the law again, or would you take matters into your own hands? I want to hear your thoughts, because this fight is far from over. The night after that threatening letter, I barely slept. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside, it all felt like her. Like Karen was out there, watching, waiting. But sometimes, the end of a storm doesn't come with thunder. It comes with silence, then a sudden strike. And that strike came 2 nights later. It was just after midnight. I was sitting in the living room, the TV on low, when I heard it again. Chains. The metallic clink that had haunted me for weeks. My heart leapt into my throat. I moved to the window, and froze. Karen was back. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 men stood with her, strangers. Their faces half hidden under hoodies. One held a crowbar. The other carried a flashlight. Karen stood in the middle, her hands on her hips, her eyes burning with a wild fury. "Tonight we finish this," she said, her voice carrying across the driveway. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an attack. I reached for my phone with shaking hands. But before I could even dial, the garage door creaked open. And there he was. Mark. My son stepped out slowly, calm as ever, his badge glinting in the pale light, his hand resting on his holster. "Karen," he called out, steady and firm, "you're done. All of you." The men stiffened, glancing at each other nervously. But Karen didn't flinch. She pointed at my son and screamed, "He's bluffing. Don't let him scare you." The man with the crowbar raised it slightly, then froze as red and blue lights lit up the street. 2 squad cars rolled up silently, headlights off until the last second. Officers poured out, surrounding the driveway. The neighbors' lights flicked on one by one, curtains opening, cameras pointing out. Karen spun around, her face twisted in shock. "No. No, this isn't happening. This is my neighborhood." Mark stepped forward, pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt. "Karen, you're under arrest. And this time, there's no coming back." The 2 men dropped their tools, raising their hands. Officers rushed in, cuffing them quickly. Karen thrashed wildly, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You traitors! You weak cowards! You'll regret this. Every single one of you." But her voice cracked under the weight of the sirens, the flashing lights, the murmurs of neighbors watching justice unfold. They pulled her hands behind her back, snapped the cuffs on tight. For the first time, she wasn't in control. She tried to twist free, her hair falling into her face, her voice breaking into sobs. This neighborhood was mine, it was mine. Mark stayed calm, his voice low but clear. No, Karen. This neighborhood was never yours. It belongs to the people who live here. And they're done being afraid. The crowd clapped again, louder this time, stronger, united. Phones filmed every second. The entire street glowed with porch lights and the flashing red and blue. As they led Karen to the squad car, she turned one last time, her eyes locking onto mine. This isn't the end, she hissed. You'll see. But when the door shut, muffling her voice, something in me shifted. For the first time, I believed it really was the end. The cars pulled away. The street fell silent. Neighbors stepped closer, some hugging, some crying, some just shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Green touched my arm, her voice trembling. It's over, isn't it? I looked around, the chains lying abandoned on the driveway, the crowbar left in the grass, the quiet strength of people standing together. Yes, I said softly. It's over. The days that followed were like waking from a bad dream. The graffiti was scrubbed away. The letters stopped. The HOA board finally admitted they had been under her thumb for too long. New elections were announced, and for once, people volunteered gladly. The neighborhood came alive again. Kids rode bikes. People planted flowers without fear of fines. Porch lights glowed warmly instead of nervously. And me? I sat on my porch one evening, coffee in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky. My son sat beside me, quiet, thoughtful. You did good, Dad, he said. I shook my head. No, we did good. All of us. Together. He smiled. For the first time in weeks, it felt like peace. But still, I couldn't forget her last words. This isn't the end. Would she try again someday? Maybe. But if she did, she'd find a neighborhood ready. A neighborhood no longer afraid. A neighborhood that learned the hard way, the power of standing together. I looked down the street, at the homes glowing in the evening light, at the people waving from their porches, and I realized something important. This wasn't just a fight against Karen. This was a fight for what a neighborhood should be. Not fear. Not control. Not bullying. But community. And now, my friends, I want to ask you this. Backhand index pointing right. If your neighborhood ever faced someone like Karen, someone who thought they owned the street, who broke laws, who wouldn't stop until they were stopped, would you stand up and fight back with your neighbors, or would you stay quiet and hope it all went away? Because in the end, the strength of a community isn't in one person's control. It's in the courage of everyone standing together.